The only law here is mine. He had no idea who the elderly black man he had just punched unconscious was, and he had even less of a clue about the man who walked into the hospital a few hours later, eyes sharp like blades. What seemed like a simple punch turned out to be a direct hit to the heart of a system far beyond his understanding. If you think this is just another case of police brutality, watch how he crumbles the moment truth slaps him in the face. Do things like this happen where you live? Is there still such a thing as justice in America? Watch until the end to find out what's going on. The last bus had left the station 5 minutes earlier, leaving the open-air stop deserted except for one man. Elijah Booker sat silently on the last stone bench, his hand resting on a worn fabric bag that had faded with time. The cold morning wind swept through the gray industrial strip behind him, carrying the burnt oil stench from distant factories. His hair was white, his beard uneven, as if it hadn't been properly shaved in days. His gaze stretched toward the railway, where freight trains often passed by each morning. No one came near him, and no one paid attention to his presence. No one knew that inside that frayed shoulder bag was a photo with old comrades, a tattered notebook, and 2 expired heart pills. A white patrol car passed by, then abruptly slowed down. Carter Maddox squinted through the window when he saw the old man sitting still at the edge of the stop. He turned the car around, backed up, and parked by the curb. Rolling the window down, he leaned out, his voice coarse and thick with bias, piercing the damp morning air. "What's that old black guy doing there like some beggar?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a veiled command for something he was used to doing, provoking those he deemed unfit for the scenery. Maddox stepped out of the vehicle, his boots thudding heavily on the pavement. He didn't draw his gun, but his hand lingered near his belt, ready to act at any movement he found suspicious. He approached with cold eyes fixed on the elderly man whose head was bowed. "Hey, you there," he called out. "What are you doing here? Do you have any ID?" Elijah Booker slowly lifted his head, eyes clouded by age and dust, unable to catch the full question. His hand fumbled inside his jacket for the hearing aid whose battery had died the night before. The air grew tenser as Maddox's brow furrowed. He repeated the question, louder this time, stepping closer to the bench. No answer came quickly enough for him. Even a moment's delay gave him license to raise his voice further, his lips tightening as if he wanted to spit out years of repressed disdain. Elijah Booker had never imagined that waiting for a bus in a nearly abandoned neighborhood would turn him into a target. The early cold was nothing compared to the chill in the officer's eyes, void of curiosity or empathy. All he saw was guilt. To Maddox, the man before him was not a veteran who had served more than 30 years. He was just a shadow in the wrong place. And in the worldview Maddox held, removing this presence or escalating further required no second thought. "This is public property. What are you doing here?" Maddox's voice carried no room for response, sharp and metallic. No look of compassion, no hint of good faith. He looked at Elijah Booker as if he were a trespasser in a forbidden zone, annoyed as if the man had ruined his morning routine. Maddox didn't see a tired old man resting. He saw a black presence at the wrong place at the wrong time. And to him, that alone was reason enough for interrogation. Elijah Booker kept his head down, hand trembling as he nudged his slipping glasses back up the bridge of his nose. He looked up slowly, blinking a few times to make out the figure looming in front of him, but the question hadn't reached his ears. His hearing aid had gone silent the night before, and he hadn't yet gone to buy a new battery. He vaguely saw the officer's lips moving, but the words were no more than a blur through the muffled haze of old age and illness. He had never been one for quick reactions, and this morning even less so. Still, every moment of delay only fueled Maddox's irritation. He stepped in closer, his heavy boot slamming onto the concrete, dragging a thick, suffocating tension with it that Elijah began to feel in the stiffening of his shoulders. "I'm talking to you, get up!" Maddox wasn't looking for an answer. He bent down and kicked the fabric bag Elijah had kept beside his foot. The kick wasn't strong enough to tear it, but it sent the bag tumbling behind the bench, landing against the jagged concrete steps and metal frame of the bus shelter with a hollow clang. Elijah flinched. His eyes widened, and his hand reached out instinctively like a soldier stripped of his weapon. In his pocket were all the things he had that morning: a faded notebook, an old bottle of heart medication, and a yellowed veteran ID card. They spilled out, slipping from the broken zipper, lying exposed under the pale early sunlight like meaningless evidence before Maddox's eyes. He didn't bother to look down, only growled, "I'm ordering you to stand up right now, or do you want me to get rough so you'll understand the law?" His face was cold, but his nostrils flared slightly as if he was savoring his upper hand. He needed no justification to assert control. He believed the law was power held in the palm of his hand, and the person standing before him was not someone the law was meant to protect. Elijah pressed both hands against the stone bench, head slightly bowed, as if straining to hear a voice through the gusting wind. He tried to articulate each word clearly, but his voice came out hoarse, lodged deep in his throat. "I'm just waiting for the bus." His breath shortened, his chest tightened with every strained syllable. He no longer had the strength to explain further, nor the clarity of mind to assess what kind of man he was dealing with. Elijah was used to suspicion, used to the watchful stares every time he walked past the wealthy neighborhoods just to get to the pharmacy. But this morning was not like those times. There was something about Maddox that chilled him, not out of fear, but because he realized this man hadn't come to ask questions. He had come to launch an assault he had already justified in his mind. Maddox narrowed his eyes, gaze sweeping down to the old man's lightly trembling hands, then suddenly grabbed his radio. One black male subject sitting at the bus stop, non-compliant, showing signs of resistance, requesting backup if necessary. He had never been threatened, yet his actions suggested he was preparing for an arrest. He fabricated a scenario to legitimize the hostility festering inside him. In that moment, the bus stop, seemingly an ordinary public place, became the scene of something far greater, a mockery of justice carried out under the guise of enforcement. And Elijah, slumped there, his vision fading, still did not know that the kick to his bag was only the beginning of a series of actions for which blood and silence would be the price Maddox would force him to pay. Elijah Booker's wrinkled hand reached toward his ear, searching for the old hearing aid that had slipped off when he recoiled from the kick to his bag. Veins bulged beneath the thin skin on the back of his hand, his yellowed, brittle nails trembling as he fumbled to twist the tiny volume knob. He had grown used to being slower than others, to the impatient looks people gave whenever he asked them to repeat something, but he had never thought that taking a few seconds to process would be enough to provoke anger. Elijah wasn't someone who spoke loudly, and this morning his throat had no strength to rise against intimidation. He only wanted to explain, to be understood, so the officer would move on and leave him to wait in peace like every other day. He slowly stood, his knees buckling for a brief moment as if gravity had grown heavier. Pain radiated from his joints to his hip, but Elijah forced himself to stay upright, unwilling to show any sign that might be interpreted as avoidance. His voice came out hoarse, half whisper, half breath, as if each word had to crawl out from his frail lungs. I'm just waiting for a bus to go home." It was a simple truth, as plain as his existence that morning. Carter Maddox heard him, but his reaction wasn't rooted in misunderstanding. He didn't need a reason to be angry. He wanted to be angry because, in his eyes, Elijah Booker was being defiant. An old, senile black man who failed to respond quickly and dared to speak in a dragging tone, as if not respecting Maddox's authority. That was how he interpreted the words, as if there was already a filter in place that twisted anything said by someone like Elijah into something else. Maddox stepped in, his thick hand clamping down on the old man's shoulder, squeezing hard as though trying to pop the joint. Without waiting another second for him to stabilize, he shoved Elijah straight into the nearby metal fence. The clang of steel crashing into brittle bone rang out, sharp and cold like the hiss of rage weaponized by power. Elijah staggered, his body knocked sideways, his back slamming into the bars as he gasped. The fence groaned, an echo pulled from places that usually held detainees. Maddox's eyes narrowed as he barked each word, his voice harsh and goading. "What's that attitude about? You want to get arrested for resisting?" Elijah didn't understand why he was shoved so violently. He had just explained why he was there. His body ached, but what stunned him wasn't the physical blow. It was the irrational fury ripping through the space between them. Since when did simply existing in public require justification? Since when did the words, "I'm just waiting for a bus," become a threat? Elijah panted, one hand gripping the fence to keep from falling. His face turned pale, spine chilled. The officer's question kept echoing in his ears, slicing over and over like a dull blade scraping the same wound. Resisting what? Where? When? All he had done was stand alone, touch no one, and say nothing wrong. Maddox remained close, his breath hitting Elijah's face, tinged with the sharpness of peppermint gum but unable to mask the stench of prejudice. He didn't need overt action to lay blame. He only needed the skin color and the delayed reaction to write his version of the scene. And he was writing it with a zeal that made it clear this was a performance he had rehearsed since his first day in uniform. Elijah swallowed, his throat raw like it had been rinsed with salt. His eyes drifted to the fabric bag now lying on the step. Everything inside was scattered under the sunlight. The notebook, the pill pack, the veteran's ID, and the faded photograph of himself and 4 others in worn uniforms. He wanted to say he had served overseas, had survived a campaign now taught in textbooks, had guarded an ammo depot under shell fire for 7 straight hours, but he knew the man before him wouldn't care. To Maddox, he was just an old black man standing in the wrong place on a morning with too few white faces around. And that alone, in Maddox's view, was reason enough to shove him into steel without waiting for a court to decide guilt. The shove threw Elijah Booker off balance. His aging legs could no longer maintain their usual coordination. His knees buckled, and his body toppled to the side like rotted timber cut halfway through. His back slammed against the concrete pillar at the corner of the bus stop, his head striking off-center against a sharp edge, sending a ringing through one ear. Before he could turn to regain his footing, he felt Maddox's hand gripping his collar, followed immediately by a heavy blow to the left side of his face. The punch was direct, without hesitation, without warning, solid and aggressive, as if the attacker didn't want to give anyone time to breathe. Elijah's jaw shifted to one side. The dry crack of a tooth breaking echoed, and blood sprayed in a bright red arc onto his faded dress shirt. The scent of blood spread quickly through the air, mingled with rusted metal, dusty cement, and the bitter taste rising from the back of his throat. He collapsed at the base of the pillar, hands pressed to the ground but unable to lift himself. His vision blurred, the morning light flaring into murky patches as if someone had poured sand into his pupils. His lips moved slightly as though trying to ask why, but his tongue had gone numb, and the blood would not stop. He could feel his body sinking closer to the pavement, inch by inch, as if the weight of his entire life was dragging him down. A scream rang out from across the street, jolting Maddox into turning his head. A white woman, holding up her phone with a horrified and furious look, was standing on the opposite sidewalk. She had just stepped out of the bakery and hadn't even taken her first bite when she saw the scene unfold. She didn't speak out of curiosity, but out of fear that if she stayed silent, the officer would do something worse. She shouted, "Oh my God, what did he even do?" Her voice echoed through the empty street, drawing a few others to turn their heads. Maddox turned fully toward her, eyes wide, face tight with tension. He didn't hide his anger at the sight of the phone recording. His voice dropped low and menacing, full of threat. "You filming this is interfering with law enforcement." He stepped toward the curb, as if to flash his badge, to issue a warning, or perhaps to take her phone. Each of his steps landed hard on the pavement like a display of dominance, thickening the air with unease. The woman stepped back, phone still raised, but her hand was starting to tremble. In those few seconds, the entire block seemed suspended between fear and outrage. Maddox knew he was being watched, but that did not slow him down. Instead, his gaze scanned the area, as if daring someone foolish enough to intervene, giving him another excuse to deepen the performance of authority he had committed himself to. On the ground, Elijah Booker curled up, one hand covering his cheek, the other unsteady beneath him. He couldn't get up, nor did he know what he was being dragged into. In his mind, sounds blurred in waves like static from an old radio. Before his eyes, the only thing he could see was his fabric bag, flung open, its contents scattered, some small bills, a chipped veteran's ID, a half-used box of heart medicine. Those had once been his whole world, and now they lay on the ground, no different than him. Maddox leaned down and yanked the wallet from Elijah's coat pocket while the old man lay groaning by the edge of the bus stop, his face twisted in pain and blood trailing steadily from the corner of his mouth. The wallet was worn, its leather edges frayed and splitting, not suggesting value, yet Maddox flipped it open impatiently, his eyes skimming through each compartment as if searching for something to justify himself, or perhaps to fuel further hostility. Inside were a few crumpled bills, a pharmacy receipt from the previous week, and a veteran ID card yellowed by time. The lettering on the card had faded, the photo was smudged beyond recognition, leaving only the barely legible words, veteran identification, and a round ink-stained stamp in the bottom right corner. Maddox pinched the card between two fingers as if it had just been pulled from a sewer. He held it up in front of his face, then scoffed, shaking his head with derision. "Who believes in this crap anymore?" he said loudly, as if the whole block needed to hear. In his hand, the card looked as thin as tissue, and with the force of someone used to gripping a baton, he tore it in half in less than half a second. The sound of the paper ripping was not loud, yet it echoed with strange pain in Elijah's chest, who still hadn't managed to sit up. One hand covered his cheek, his eye barely open, just enough to see what had happened. The torn halves of the card drifted to the ground like broken wings, landing next to the old fabric bag now gaping open. Maddox wasn't finished. He bent down and stepped directly on one half of the card, his black boot caked with mud, crushing the soft plastic under his sole, then twisting it like extinguishing trash. His voice was heavy, deliberate, and sharp. "There's only one law here, and it's mine." He straightened up after that statement, as if he had just delivered a verdict. Not from any court, but from a code written by men who wore uniforms and believed every furrow of their brow carried the weight of decree. Elijah shifted his head slightly, his vision blurring from the blood sticking to his eyelids, cold sweat tracing down the back of his neck. He tried to lift his arm, but it barely responded. A rush of questions swirled in his mind. Why this morning? Why that man? Why was the card he had carried with pride for more than 20 years torn in front of him by someone who had no idea who he was? Elijah had never needed to shout for justice, yet in that silent stare of his, something cracked, something deep and wordless. The fragile belief that the veteran card might shield him from this kind of humiliation was collapsing. Across the street, the white woman still stood frozen, her grip on her phone tighter than before. She couldn't take her eyes off what she was witnessing. The cruelty needed no disguise. The abuse of power was raw and performed with an ease that suggested choreography. It was as if a public space in daylight had become a stage for violence, sanctioned by uniform and badge. She had seen the clips online, read similar stories, but watching it unfold, each move, each cold phrase, each crunch of a boot on that card, she finally felt the suffocating weight she once assumed was exaggerated. Suddenly her question was not, will anyone step in, but how many have walked away pretending they didn't see? Maddox returned to Elijah's side, offering no further words. Wind swept through the space between them, blowing pieces of paper from the wallet a few feet away. One of them was the prescription note. Another was an old photo of men in uniform lined up outside a barracks. Maddox did not look, or perhaps chose not to see. He stepped back, lifted his chin as if completing a routine. Elijah lay still, hand brushing the ground, his half-open eyes struggling to accept that his identity had just been erased in front of someone who knew nothing about honor. And the sting in his chest now came not from the blow, but from the sound of that tear, a silent verdict louder than words. Elijah Booker tilted his head, the side of his face swollen from the punch, looking like a bruised lump. Blood from the tear at the corner of his mouth had begun to dry into a crust, sticking to his chin, and every breath he let out sent pain radiating across his lower jaw. His vision blurred, light stabbing his retinas in a chaotic mix of white and black, stinging and cold. On his left ear, where his hearing aid once clung tightly, there was now only bare skin. Elijah reached out by reflex, his fingers fumbling across the cold cement ground, brushing thick dust, trying to locate the small device that had flown off during Maddox's assault. He could no longer speak, only let out stifled groans caught in his throat, the broken sounds of someone desperately trying to grasp the one thing that let him hear the world. His trembling finger touched the curved edge of the plastic, then slipped and searched again. Lying at the edge of the shelter's shadow, Elijah moved quietly, as if the motion itself was the last anchor keeping him conscious. The spot on his head that had struck the pillar earlier now throbbed with a deep, relentless ache. He didn't know whether he was being watched or had already been abandoned. Time seemed frozen in the slow motion of his aging hands, the early wind-swept dust across the pavement, blowing scraps of paper from his canvas bag even farther, and the hearing aid was now somewhere among torn wrappers, broken plastic, and fresh footprints, stamped into the rough tile. Across the street, at another bus stop about 15 meters away, a young black man in a worker's uniform was waiting for the morning bus to the steel mill. He had seen everything from the moment the patrol car braked in the empty intersection. At first, he thought it was a routine ID check or a misunderstanding that would quickly resolve. But when the punches landed, when the old man was shoved into the metal post like a lifeless sack, when the veteran ID was torn and stomped on in front of him, the young man's hand tightened around his phone out of instinct. No one had ever taught him to record video in moments like that, and no one had ever told him staying silent was the right thing to do. But in that moment, he simply lifted the phone, turned on the camera, and said nothing. His face tensed, the vein in his neck rising, his palms soaked with sweat until the phone began slipping. He held tighter, so tight his fingertips bled as his nails dug into his skin just to keep it steady. Everything in front of him was clear as a charge sheet. An unarmed, black, elderly man, not shouting, lying on the ground with blood soaking into his shirt, a white police officer standing nearby as if he had just dealt with a rat, and contempt still frozen on his face like a clenched fist not yet withdrawn. The young man didn't know what he could do, but he knew what would happen if no one recorded it. So he kept filming, trying to hold the image as steady as he could, every second a piece of evidence, a truth no one could erase. And in his eyes, between fury and numbness, there was a quiet resolve. This wasn't the first time, but if he could make sure this one didn't vanish like the others, then maybe, just maybe, something would be different. The emergency room at Southridge Hospital in the early morning still carried the scent of freshly sprayed disinfectant, the plastic smell of movable curtains, and the clatter of bed wheels across the gleaming white floor. A young nurse held a clipboard, jotting down blood pressure readings while glancing at the man brought in less than 10 minutes ago. His face was swollen, one cheek dark purple, with dried blood caked in patches along his chin. His shirt was wrinkled, stained with blood at the collar and left hem. His right hand curled toward his chest, knuckles stiff as if frozen. He had been brought in unconscious, with no known identity, no family by his side. The nurse leaned toward the EMT who had wheeled in the gurney. Her voice was low but firm. "What's his name?" "No ID? No one claimed him?" The orderly shook his head, pointing to the police officer leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze distant as if his work was already done. She stepped closer to him, voice quieter but still professional. "Do you have any information on the patient? This is a critical case. We need to contact the family." The officer jerked his head toward the bed and curled his lip in irritation. "Homeless guy, uncooperative, could be drunk or mentally unstable. Run full tests, and if he wakes up, ask him. If not, send him to medical holding." The answer made the nurse pause for a moment. She turned back to look at the man lying motionless on the bed, face bruised, mouth slightly open as if still clinging to an unfinished explanation. He didn't resemble the transient cases she had handled before. No smell of alcohol, no signs of wandering. The items found in his torn pockets, though shredded, included slips of paper with numbers, clearly written medication notes, nothing like the disjointed remnants of someone suffering memory loss. She sensed something was off. The officer remained by the wall, eyes fixed on his phone. His report was already filed, stating the man had acted erratically, refused cooperation, unable to verify identity. A clean document, enough to let everything slide, leaving no trail. He knew the hospital wouldn't have time to verify his words, and with no family to dispute the story, every sentence in his report would become official truth. The nurse returned to the medical station, drew a blood sample, and wrote, "Coma condition, suspected cranial trauma, identity unknown." She considered adding notes about the intake context, but stopped herself. What she had seen left her more uneasy than confused. She remembered the man's eyes as he was wheeled in. Despite his near unconscious state, there had been a flicker of resistance, swallowed back into silence. She went back to the bed, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, and gently removed bits of debris clinging to his hair. Part of a hearing aid strap was caught on his collar. She picked it up, set it on the metal table by the head of the bed, and stared at it for a long moment. In the small storage room at the corner of the ward, the temporary file box for unidentified patients was nearly full. She knew some had lain there for days before vanishing from the hospital without a name, no one searching for them. She also knew some had gone months without being called by their names, tagged instead as Patient X, unnamed male number 5, then transferred in the middle of the night under the cold authority of internal memos. On his wrist, the patient bracelet, printed hastily by an in-house machine, bore only the words, "Unknown male, est 70 to 75. She looked at that line, then back at the battered face, pausing in silence for a few seconds. Cases like this were never fully investigated unless someone spoke up, and she didn't believe his story was the whole truth. The nurse sat down and typed a supplementary note into the system. In it, she added a single line, "Suspected veteran. Distinct signs differ from homeless individuals. No next of kin identified. Recommend checking local veteran registry." She wasn't sure it would help, but at the very least, it was a way to preserve some fragment of this man's identity before everything was buried under the silence that those reports were trying to construct. The CT scan results appeared on the bright blue screen in the imaging room. The attending physician stared at the dark mass on the left side of the skull, the dense blood pooling near the temple, trailing down toward the orbital socket, along with a clearly defined fracture to the cheekbone. The extent of the injury indicated the impact was far from accidental. He clicked the mouse to enlarge the cranial map, then turned to the nurse beside him, his voice firm. "Severe cranial trauma, left side hematoma, deep coma. No light reflex in either pupil. Transfer to intensive care. Monitor intracranial pressure continuously. Prepare emergency surgery file in case of further decline." Elijah Booker had been moved to the specialized care unit, lying motionless on a hospital bed, wires coiled across his chest, the heart monitor beeping at a steady but heavy rhythm. A thin bandage crossed his forehead diagonally, and the left side of his face was swollen and bruised, like a wound left after battle. As the medical team cleared equipment, Nurse Clara, a small-statured Latina woman with sharp yet compassionate eyes, entered with a clipboard. She glanced at the monitor, then bent down to reread the intake notes. The repeated lines made her pause. Unidentified homeless male, no known relatives, no documentation. Clara sat beside the bed, studying the swollen face closely, her gaze drifting across details others had overlooked. Behind the left ear there was still a faint bronze stain where the hearing aid strap had once rested. The eyebrows were thick but neatly shaped, the face weathered but not ragged, showing no signs of street life. His left hand, though wrinkled, still had pronounced veins, and the nails were evenly trimmed, nothing like the neglected state typical of the homeless. Clara had worked at this hospital for more than 11 years, long enough to know the difference between someone truly anonymous and someone made anonymous by a system that never bothered to ask. There was something about this man that struck a chord, as if she had seen him before, in a photo or at a memorial service. She couldn't be certain, but instinct urged her to act. When no one else was in the room, Clara quietly took out her phone, walked to the bedside, set it to silent, and took a close-up photo of his face. She didn't plan to post it in the usual charity groups, where the image would quickly be buried under other posts. Instead, she opened a private group called Veterans Watch, made up of former soldiers, their families, and medical staff who had worked with military personnel. The photo was uploaded with a simple but precise caption. Male, approximately 70 years old, admitted to Southridge this morning. Deep coma, no identification, suspected veteran. Does anyone recognize this man? Clara hit send, watching the loading symbol spin once before it stopped. She knew the post might go unnoticed or be filtered out by algorithms, but maybe, just maybe, someone scrolling through might pause at the sight of a familiar face. She wasn't certain, but from the moment she looked into his eyes earlier, she felt this was not a man meant to disappear without mention, and she refused to let him fade simply because the system chose to ignore him. Inside the duty room of the district police headquarters, the pale white glow of fluorescent lights cast a sterile chill over the workspace. Carter Maddox leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, typing quickly as if this were just another routine report following a dull patrol. He wrote without much thought, the sentences flowing like a template engraved in his memory. Black male subject, approximately over 70 years old, exhibited uncooperative behavior, responded vaguely, suspected signs of behavioral disorder, preliminary assessment, unstable mental state, carried no identification, identity could not be verified at the scene, officers ensured safety and transferred the subject to medical personnel for further handling. The final line was a safe closure. Safety ensured. 3 emotionless words, omitting any mention of cuts, bruises, or punches, do not refer to the bloodied face of the old man. Maddox paused, adjusted his posture, then pressed save and printed 2 copies. The paper rolled out of the machine as if truth had just been formatted. On it was everything he needed to lock the case away, letting it slide down the same path as countless other reports, folded, filed, and forgotten. Behind him, the door clicked open with a familiar creak. A younger officer entered, holding a plastic coffee cup, glancing at the whiteboard before looking down at Maddox. Recognizing his colleague, he smirked, tilted his head, and asked, "All done? Took down another old black guy, huh?" The words slipped out like a casual joke between coworkers, but the tone reeked of numbness and scorn. Maddox didn't respond immediately. He leaned further back, flipping through the printed report as if reviewing it for accuracy. Then he smirked, shrugged, and said, "I'll be real, people like that need to be shown who's in charge from the start, or it's trouble later on." His voice flowed smoothly, echoing the lines he had just typed, void of any regret. He laid the report on the desk, slid it aside, and raised his hand to catch the congratulatory shoulder pat from his colleague, as if he had just executed a textbook arrest. No one in the room asked for details. No one questioned what the old man had said or done, whether he was armed or how he reacted when thrown against the fence and punched in the face. No one wondered why a man that old needed to be assaulted to safety. No one cared about the gaps in the narrative, as they were too familiar with how to pad them with sterile legal terms. Reports like that were nothing new here. The cleaner they read, the harder they were to challenge. And Maddox understood that well. From the corner of the room, the hum of a fan whined, sending a chill across the desks and making the papers flutter slightly. Maddox glanced at the clock, then stood up, folded the original report into a file folder, and clipped the other copy into the report binder in the second drawer. He did not read it again. As far as he was concerned, the incident was over. An old, stubborn black man didn't follow instructions, went down, scanned off, sent off in an ambulance. He had followed the procedure, used the correct terminology, and sealed every crack with language shielded by the authority of the uniform. Before leaving the room, he looked back over his shoulder and sneered, shedding the weight of a bothersome morning. Bet he's on oxygen somewhere now. Probably can't even remember his name. The officers nearby chuckled. dry and hollow, unaware or uncaring that somewhere out there a man had just been stripped of his name in a report that now existed in two perfectly formatted copies. Maddox leaned against the edge of the table, hands in his pockets, chewing gum with a slow, mocking rhythm. The scent of mint drifted faintly through the air, but it couldn't mask the discomfort radiating from his attitude. A coworker, pouring another cup of coffee, asked offhandedly, "Did that old guy have a veteran ID?" Maddox shrugged, shifted the gum to one cheek, and replied, without looking up, "They're old, they've got a card, so what? Still just freeloaders. Faking patriotism for lifetime perks. To me, they're no different from drunks slumped by the curb, except they carry a wrinkled photo ID." As the words left his mouth, the room fell silent for a few brief seconds, like someone had dropped something heavy onto the floor. But no one objected, and no one responded. Those nearby simply lowered their heads toward their screens, one quietly typing, another flipping through a notepad as if they hadn't heard a thing. Maddox understood that silence. It wasn't disagreement. It was silent complicity. They didn't need to applaud his words or laugh along. As long as no one questioned him, no one recorded anything, it was enough for him to know his thoughts weren't alone. He turned back to his desk and opened the personal data storage box. Within minutes, he had logged into the patrol unit's internal archive system. Under his name was a string of body cam clips, recorded from the moment the patrol car slowed down to the second he left the scene. Maddox didn't need to replay them. He remembered every second what he said, where he struck. He also knew that footage would not help him if anyone started asking questions. He called the system officer, his tone curt but not exactly secretive. "Delete this morning's footage. Camera from 6:17 to 6:29. No point keeping that kind of horror show." The other man hesitated slightly, eyes scanning the timestamps. A status line appeared, not yet backed up. Maddox crossed his arms and exhaled sharply through his nose. "Good. Then wipe it from the root. Don't let anyone see me dealing with that old man like I was dumping a walking corpse. Clean is best. In this precinct, the word of someone trusted could override any form. Once a file was deleted at the root, it didn't go to the event archive, nor did it appear in internal affairs reports. It became a case labeled "No video footage available." In Maddox's mental playbook, that meant the incident would pass without a shred of evidence against him. He stood up, grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, and turned lazily. "I'm heading home. If anyone asks, say I'm finalizing the report." Before leaving, he added one last line that sounded almost like advice. "Not everything's worth keeping around to give you a headache later." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving behind a morning where he had torn someone's life apart, and the footage he knew no one would recover. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, casting his shadow on the tile floor like a long, faded streak of ink, thin and pale, just like the justice he had erased from the system with a single click. A nearly 2-minute clip was uploaded to the X platform before dawn, shared by a personal account with few followers, its profile picture a faint image of a night shift worker. The caption, typed in all caps, read, "Police punches elderly veteran unconscious for being black." The video begins with Elijah Booker leaning against the bus stop railing, his face blurred in the dim morning light. Behind him, a white police officer approaches, his face tense, mouthing coercive questions. Within seconds, a punch, blood splattering, the old man collapsing like a shattered statue. Viewers experienced the scene through chaotic background sounds. Whipping wind, a woman's distant scream, the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground, and a threatening voice behind the camera. What outraged people wasn't just the violence, but the officer's indifferent demeanor afterward, as if everything was within acceptable bounds, as if an elderly man being knocked unconscious required no explanation. Within 30 minutes of posting, the clip was being rapidly shared. Initial spreaders included the black veteran community, followed by human rights groups and then local media. Major accounts joined in, adding the hashtag #JusticeForElijah along with shortened video excerpts. The veteran ID card being stomped on, the hearing aid flying from his ear, and the image of him lying motionless with blood soaking his collar all became widely circulated images that morning. In just 6 hours, justice for Elijah climbed straight to the top trending topics, ranking among the top 3 nationwide. Some initially thought it was a fictional character's name until they clicked and saw the full story. Calls for justice, angry and sorrowful comments flooded in. He could be my father, my grandfather. This isn't the first time I've seen such a video, but it chokes me up every time. Why are elderly people like Elijah still being beaten as if they don't deserve to live longer? Some found old photos of him from past articles where he was honored at a local veterans memorial. Though faded, his face was recognizable. A man in uniform with a calm gaze, standing beside fellow white-haired comrades holding a flag, his expression aged but resolute. The contrast between that image and the video fueled a surge of anger. People no longer saw this as an isolated incident. It began to represent a long list of forgotten names. This time, social media transformed a raw video into a public indictment, propelling Elijah Booker to the center of a much larger reckoning than the initial punch. Among the hundreds of thousands of non-stop comments scrolling beneath the viral video, one line emerged like a slow detonation in a sea of outrage. I know him, and I swear I will not let this disappear. The message wasn't long, wasn't bolded, and didn't carry any special tags. Yet, the number of users clicking to read it in full quickly pushed it to the top of the Justice for Elijah thread. The account had no clear profile photo. The username displayed only 2 words: S. Booker. But what caught people's attention wasn't the presentation, it was the tone. It didn't carry the flavor of generic rage, nor the usual threats that erupt when social media catches fire. It was a statement of weight. It wasn't a question. It was a truth awaiting action to make it real. People began to wonder, who is S. Booker? What is their relationship to Elijah? A grandchild? An old acquaintance? A fellow soldier? Speculation surfaced, but the account responded to no one. The comment remained untouched, like a strange marker in the timeline of an act of violence slowly coming to light. A few adept social media users tried to trace the account. They searched across platforms, scanned others sharing the same last name, and cross-referenced data from veteran events, but the trail stayed cold. It seemed this person did not want to be found, or perhaps their identity was simply too significant to reveal, at least for now. Among the replies, some began echoing the words as a kind of rallying cry. Phrases like, "I won't let this disappear," and "this will not be forgotten," spread quietly into an undercurrent. S. Booker, without showing up again, had planted a seed in the minds of readers that needed no repetition. That line gave the movement a sharper aim, a clearer target. It carried something most justice pleas lack, a personal vow, quiet enough to make people stop and take it seriously. Journalists took note. Within hours, news updates began adding the line, "An account believed to be connected to Mr. Elijah Booker has declared they will pursue the case to the end." It started appearing in television summaries, echoed in regional news briefs, and became the punctuation mark on a story still burning. In a few offices on the east side of the city, people who didn't normally watch online footage sat down to listen as coworkers described the case. When the image of Elijah lying unconscious played on screen, accompanied by the words, "I know him," and "I swear I will not let this disappear," many couldn't look away. That sentence, alone in a torrent of angry data, carried the weight of an oath passed from one real person to another, bypassing the digital haze. And just as the public outrage seemed ready to follow its usual path, spread fast, then fade, the comment held the heartbeat that was beginning to falter. No one knew for sure who S. Booker was, but everyone understood that the one who wrote that line wasn't bluffing. And so, from a video seemingly destined to drown in countless similar stories, the case involving Elijah Booker began to carry the shadow of someone quiet in the background, ready to step forward if needed. And for those who once believed they would never be held accountable, that was the first crack. As the ICU clock ticked just past midnight, the hallway of Southridge Hospital remained hauntingly silent. Dim white lights stretched across polished floors. Hospital beds were hidden behind drawn curtains, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of ventilators humming from the emergency rooms. A night nurse reviewing the medication list looked up as a figure appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with decisiveness but no haste. The man wore a neat black suit, a scratched metal watch visible at his wrist, and no police badge or any usual government insignia. He did not knock. With a simple flash of a small card bordered in dull silver, he silenced the attendant instantly. On the card were 3 lines: National Security Agency, Sensitive Operations, and a special code beneath a vague name. The attending doctor, who had been writing preliminary notes on the comatose, unidentified male patient, looked up at him, her expression briefly startled. "Are you the patient's relative?" Her voice was calm but edged with wariness and unease. The man did not hesitate. He pulled out the card again, placed it gently on the stainless steel desk between them, and locked eyes with her, speaking with measured firmness. "I'm his biological son. My name is Solomon Booker." That name landed like a verdict, suspending the entire space for a heartbeat. The doctor took a moment to link the data. Elijah Booker, unidentified male patient, a veteran possibly assaulted at a public bus stop, in deep coma, under special observation. And now, this man had entered as if the entire identification process required no DNA test or paperwork. The way he spoke, his gaze, his bearing, made it clear he was not someone who needed to prove anything. Solomon requested no further details from the hospital. He already knew enough. On his way there, he had accessed the preliminary CT scan from the federal medical system. He had seen the images of cranial trauma, noted the hematomas and the hairline fracture on the cheekbone. He had also read the initial report from the police department, where Carter Maddox stated that his father was combative, displayed signs of mental instability, and was handled to prevent danger. It was all written in that same smooth, sterile tone Solomon had read hundreds of times in case files documenting civil rights violations in jurisdictions flagged for abuse of power. But this was no distant file on a desk. This was his father, the man who taught him to disassemble and reassemble a rifle when he was 10, the man who carefully folded his uniform and stored it in a cedar trunk long after retired, the man who took him every month to sweep leaves off the graves of fallen comrades at the military cemetery. And now he lay there in a cold bed, wrapped in wires, his identity erased from records, his veteran ID torn in two. Solomon stepped closer to the bedside. He looked at his father for a long time, the light casting shadows along his thin nose and swollen left cheek. The old man's hand trembled lightly beneath the blanket. Without touching the injury, Solomon could sense how deep the pain went. He didn't cry. His face stayed composed, just as it always did when handling the worst intelligence briefings. But this time, what needed to be addressed wasn't in satellite coordinates or leaked IP chain. It was here, right in the city, embedded in the very system he had once believed would feel shame when someone crossed the line. He turned to the doctor. "I need the full medical file. Every scan, everything connected to him since he was brought in, and I'll personally coordinate with internal affairs." The doctor nodded. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The man standing here was not an ordinary relative, and for the first time during her entire shift, she felt this case would not fade away like the others. Solomon Booker had just walked in, bringing with him a quiet quake that was only beginning to shake the ground. Solomon Booker had once served as Deputy Director of Strategic Security in the Division for International Counterterrorism Analysis. During 11 years at the highest level of one of the country's most sophisticated and secretive agencies, he never made public appearances and never revealed personal ties on any platform. What little others knew about him lived mostly in classified internal reports. He had overseen cross-center extremist behavioral analysis programs, had identified targets for aerial campaigns in the northern Syrian desert, and had designed counter-offensive plans through network systems. He was used to confronting shadows and making decisions that were never documented. But tonight, he brought no team, no data models, no contingency strategies. What he faced now wasn't a terror network, but a system he knew intimately, one rotting from the inside out. And the man lying there beneath white light and the flicker of the ventilator was the reason he had to step out from the anonymity he had maintained for over a decade. Solomon stood still by the hospital bed. His father's body lay motionless. Oxygen tube across the bridge of his nose, the left side of his face still swollen, a small stitch at the mouth where a tear neared the jawbone. That body had once carried crates of ammunition in the border defense campaign of 1988. If that body once jogged every Sunday morning well into his 60s, once carried Solomon across a river field camp, once repaired every broken hinge in their house, without asking for help. And now it lay there, gray and still, as if a lifetime of dignity had been erased by a single punch from a man with a badge claiming to serve the community. Solomon's gaze did not leave his father's face. There was no panic, no pity, no grief. Only a silence stretched, taut like water moments before it breaks into waves. He breathed slowly, head slightly bowed, then whispered, not quite for his father to hear, but as a message to himself, "He doesn't know who he touched. But I know exactly who he is." The words weren't a threat, nor a burst of vengeance. They were the conclusion of someone who had locked onto a target. Solomon didn't say Maddox's name. He didn't need to. Every action that morning had already been recorded. Every internal report had passed through his hands within 6 hours of the footage going public. He knew every move the officer had made, who handled the body cam files, and who signed off on the final report. But more than that, he understood what kind of man Maddox was, the kind raised in an environment where power was permission, shaped by protection and indifference, and taught to believe they would never face consequences. Solomon remained beside the bed, head tilted slightly toward his father. He didn't touch the man's hand, didn't lean down to speak. His eyes tracked the numbers on the heart monitor, the graphs pulsing slowly like the resistance his father hadn't yet been able to voice. This was no longer just an assault. For Solomon, it was a test of the very system he had once helped oversee. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't assessing risks for an agency. He was assessing it for one man, his father, Elijah Booker, a man who should never have ended up unconscious in the night just because of the gaze of a young cop with too little empathy and too much power. Solomon Booker did not leave the hospital after confirming his father's identity. He rented a room facing the ICU in the same building, quietly set up an NSA-grade encrypted laptop, and tunneled into the police network through security tiers available only to former strategic analysts. Within 12 minutes, he had traced the full record of Carter Maddox, the officer who had injured his father. The file revealed nothing unexpected. Maddox, male, 32, graduate of a state police academy, assigned to Southridge 4 years earlier, had 7 complaints for excessive force, all involving black citizens, most labeled intervention beyond necessary force. Solomon opened each case. Every file followed the same pattern, stopping people without cause, interrogating in a demeaning tone, using force without warning, and reports always ending with, handled per protocol, no serious misconduct. 3 of those incidents never reached the press, not for lack of evidence, but because the victims belonged to overlooked groups. An elderly homeless man shoved against a wall and left with a dislocated shoulder, a black woman from a nursing home dragged off a bus after being mistaken for a petty thief, and a young man with mild neurological disorder struck with a baton after wandering into an industrial parking lot. Solomon studied each entry. The motif never changed. Maddox wrote that the subject acted unclearly, refused to cooperate, or posed a public safety concern. Body cam footage, when it existed, was noted as device malfunction, data not saved, or deleted for internal security. Every report bore a supervisor's signature, officers apparently accustomed to administrative maneuvers that papered over widening cracks inside the department. He understood what he was seeing. This was no lone misconduct. It was a chain reaction sustained by the system's silent consent. The point was not what Maddox did, but why he remained untouched each time. Now the cost was being paid not by Maddox, but by Solomon's elderly father, beaten into a coma for choosing the wrong bench at the wrong hour. Pulling up a timeline analysis, Solomon saw that in the past 2 years, Maddox had logged more than 300 patrols, nearly 20% involving black individuals, a rate 4 times the regional average. The officer favored routes through poor neighborhoods and bus stops frequented by the unhoused. These numbers were buried in the data, yet anyone determined to dig would map a clear pattern, exactly the sort of pattern Solomon once used to capture shadowy militant leaders. Maddox was an unchecked cog, and what angered Solomon most was the indifference of those meant to inspect that cog. They read reports as routine, approved video deletions with a mindless nod, and called punches proper procedure. Somewhere they sat unaware that this time the victim was a father to a man who had brought down networks far darker than they could imagine. Solomon closed his laptop, his eyes darkening like a pane of glass clouded over by fog. The data was complete. The next phase would not live in the system, it would happen out in the real world, where he would force everyone to answer the questions they always believed they could ignore. Solomon Booker did not wait for daylight to act. Right after finishing his analysis of the data chain and pinpointing a critical vulnerability in the internal oversight system, he typed an urgent email marked with the highest priority and sent it directly to 3 addresses: the Department of Justice, the Federal Inspector General, and the Internal Civil Rights Investigation Unit. The subject line held only 8 words: urgent, request investigation before it's too late. In the body, he was brief but left out nothing. The victim was Elijah Booker, a military veteran, currently in a coma in the ICU after being assaulted by Officer Carter Maddox. He attached the viral video clip, an excerpt from the internal file noting 7 prior complaints against Maddox, 3 of which had no public record, along with a patrol frequency map highlighting a clear pattern of racially motivated targeting. At the bottom, he closed with a single, decisive line: "The system is preparing to erase the evidence. If you do not intervene immediately, the proof will be destroyed within hours." The email was encrypted with military-grade protocol and confirmed as sent at 3:13 a.m. Just minutes later, the automated response system replied, "Received. Emergency escalation to Federal Response Team." But Solomon understood that delays didn't happen at the speed of machines, but in the reflexes of people within layers of administrative control. So he didn't leave his desk, instead continuing to monitor real-time data streams through the auxiliary network his old clearance still granted him. At exactly 4:18 a.m., a warning flashed on the urban camera interface. Bus Station Area 6 system cameras paused for scheduled maintenance. Solomon immediately dug deeper, checking the buffer storage system, which still held backup data from the last 12 hours, before syncing to the main archive. Every video file from the 2 corner stations, both covering the area where Elijah was attacked, had been marked deleted, a timestamp matching precisely 1 hour after he sent his email. He tightened his fist slightly, needing no words. Every reaction was exactly as expected. When the system is exposed, its first instinct is not to verify but to cover up. This so-called scheduled maintenance had never taken place at that hour in 3 years. Each camera had its public maintenance schedule in the city's system, and the latest for this area was 2 weeks prior. Wiping all the data at once, at precisely the most sensitive spot, was a sharp and familiar counterstrike, the kind Solomon had seen in high-level regional cover-ups. He opened another panel to check the most recent access to the regional storage server. The trail revealed that an internal account had logged in from a backup data station less than 2 blocks away. The person who performed the deletion was a technician with the City Technical Services Department, acting under the direct instruction of a representative from the police department's HR office. Solomon lowered his hands from the keyboard, his eyes holding their steady calm. The night was not over, and every step ahead would have to be calculated with even greater precision. If they had begun erasing traces, it only confirmed one thing: fear had started to take hold. And once a system becomes afraid of its actions, he knew he had struck the nerve that makes even the strongest foundations begin to tremble. Solomon Booker did not stop after sending a warning email. On the same night, he reorganized every complaint file tied to Carter Maddox, tagging each case by priority, complete with dates, testimonies, and the agency's vague conclusions. He even restored a packet that had been moved to an old archive. Few people held clearance for it, containing a grievance from a retired police officer filed 6 years earlier. The complainant, Douglas Herndon, had worked with Maddox in Southridge's investigative unit during the officer's first year there. In his statement, Douglas wrote, "Maddox loses control whenever he encounters black individuals, especially elders or vulnerable people. During the 3 patrol shifts we shared, he always initiated random stops, questioned without cause, and showed blatant hostility." Douglas added that he once requested Maddox be suspended for psychological evaluation, but superiors dismissed the request, claiming no concrete evidence of racial bias. Solomon pulled that letter into a separate folder, marked it in red, and attached it to a compilation sent to the Special Inspector Division, an independent body authorized to investigate officers without internal approval. Alongside it, he included a lengthy appendix he authored analyzing Maddox's behavioral pattern through a strategic security lens. He demonstrated that Maddox's interactions with black citizens were not only disproportionately high, but also focused on highly vulnerable groups: the elderly, the unhoused, and individuals showing neurological disorders. The report opened with a decisive line: "Officer Carter Maddox's conduct matches a deliberate pattern of racialized violence." The final sentence struck harder. This officer was previously recommended for badge removal due to conduct violations, but the recommendation was blocked by his direct supervisor, suggesting internal cover-up. Solomon inserted links to 3 internal meeting minutes. In one meeting held last year, Maddox's own superior postponed disciplinary action because there was insufficient media pressure. In other words, without video evidence or clear witnesses, all wrongdoing would have remained folded away like a stain under the hallway carpet of justice. When he sent the dossier, Solomon added a brief note at the bottom: "I will not let this fade into silence. Each day of delay makes another person invisible." After sending, he walked to the window, where the first light of morning brushed the row of buildings across the street. In that moment, the city was barely awake, yet the data he had dispatched was already beyond the reach of anyone hoping to bury it. Truth, once thrust into daylight, never returns to dormancy. This time it was safeguarded by someone who had toppled networks far more intricate than any set of lies a local precinct could weave. Solomon Booker understood better than anyone how the machinery of cover-ups operated. He had seen too many reports filed away, had taken part in operations that severed chains of wrongdoing that dragged on for years simply because no one was willing to ask the right questions at the right time. But this time, everything was different. The victim was his father, a man who had carried a gun to defend the country, who had taught him where the line of honor lay. Solomon would not allow anyone to turn this case into another forgotten statistic. Immediately after submitting the full complaint file, he sent a demand for a public investigation to 3 separate agencies. The message carried no polite wording or ambiguity. It was a moral imperative disguised as a formal request. He wrote, "No closed proceedings. No, keep this internal. The investigation must have outside oversight. Results must be public, and all related data must be fully explained before the public." At the bottom, he signed his full name: Solomon Booker, Deputy Director of Strategic Affairs, NSA, on leave for personal reasons. He knew the weight that name carried, and as expected, in less than 24 hours the reaction spread across the news. Even neutral publications like the Herald Tribune began asking questions, leading with headlines that shook the public. Why is Officer Maddox still armed on patrol after 7 abuse complaints? Other media outlets quickly followed, quoting excerpts from the old file Solomon provided and listing the victims from Maddox's prior internal investigations that had all been quietly dropped. Reporters flooded the Southridge Police Department headquarters. They brought printed copies of the complaint by former Officer Douglas Herndon, patrol data maps showing clear racial targeting, and especially the video of Maddox tearing up the veteran ID right in front of Elijah Booker as he bled. That image, blood, torn paper, the look of fury, became the symbol of a rising wave of anger. What was supposed to be a routine internal briefing turned into a full press conference under pressure from dozens of news outlets, forcing the department spokesperson to respond. When asked why Maddox had not been suspended, she only replied, "Officer Maddox is under review, but there is no official conclusion yet." That answer triggered instant backlash. Major outlets splashed headlines. 7 investigations, 1 man unconscious, but no conclusion. How much is enough? On social media, the hashtag Justice for Elijah continued to trend. Veteran organizations joined in, sending letters demanding that the Attorney General speak out personally. The State Police Conduct Oversight Board announced an independent investigation had opened. A black senator from a neighboring state shared the video on his page with the caption, "No one gets to kick a veteran in the face. Not today." Solomon did not give interviews. He did not need to appear. He only needed the truth to keep pushing forward, layer by layer, the way he once peeled secrets from illegal networks. Only this time, he was not using nets to catch international criminals. He was using facts to rot out the false shell of peace the local system was trying to protect. The next morning, as Solomon left his hotel to return to the hospital, he saw a group of elderly people standing at the bus stop where his father had been attacked. They wore heavy coats, each holding a photo of Elijah Booker. No one chanted slogans. They simply stood there, quietly, like a row of living witnesses. And this time, no one could erase that image from any camera. In a conference hall with more than 300 seats, white lights blazed over the South Ridge Police Department logo while cameras stood ready, microphones aimed at the podium where Human Resources Chief Meredith Kline prepared her remarks. In the front row sat reporters from nearly 20 news outlets. Headlines drafted, pointed questions rehearsed. This was no internal briefing. It was a public inquest into a system now accused of shielding wrongdoing. Kline stepped forward, face neutral, voice measured like a routine report. "We acknowledge public concern regarding Officer Carter Maddox. Internal Affairs is reviewing all evidence and will issue findings as soon as possible. Maddox is a capable officer who has completed many difficult frontline duties. We ask the public to wait for the investigation results and avoid emotional judgments." The room fell silent for one beat. Then questions surged. A reporter from the second row called out, "Do you consider punching an elderly veteran into a coma part of proper duty?" Kline replied evasively, "I will not comment on specifics before the official conclusion." Another asked, "Did the department decline to investigate prior complaints against Maddox?" She repeated, "We are conducting a comprehensive review." Backstage, Maddox stood with arms folded, uniform crisp, head slightly bowed as if waiting to proclaim his innocence. He seemed unfazed by the tension. When his lawyer leaned in to whisper, Maddox let out a dry laugh and muttered, "Rich black folks only make threats, they cannot do anything." His tone was casual, as though stating a simple fact. To him, press conferences were theater, online outrage mere undercurrent, and the structure around him felt unshakable. The lawyer showed no reaction. Men like Maddox had passed through his hands many times. The strategy was always to stretch investigations, delay conclusions, and let public heat cool, a tried tactic when the opposition held only video clips, hashtags, and a few heartfelt interviews. Yet Maddox missed one shift in the pattern. This time, the other side held more than a hashtag. Solomon Booker had not appeared before reporters or issued statements, but the dossier he sent had reopened every old complaint like a wound exposed to noon sunlight. Maddox also failed to notice that one floor above, a Department of Justice representative was watching the press conference through a private live stream. While Kline spoke familiar lines about full cooperation, Maddox smirked, hand resting on his belt, confident the storm would pass. At that exact hour, Solomon's second email arrived on the desk of the Federal Inspector General, this one requesting criminal indictment and stamped with absolute priority evidence. The briefing ended with many questions unanswered. Outside, clusters of people gathered at the station gates. No banners waved. They simply stood, small groups facing the glass facade as a silent challenge. In that moment, stillness began to take the shape of an approaching storm. On the rooftop of the Central Press Building, wind rustled through the tall glass panels. Solomon Booker leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the darkening sky signaled an approaching storm. Down on the street, traffic still crowded the lanes, red lights flickering as if nothing had changed. But on another plane of reality, the network of pieces he had carefully assembled over the past days was tightening, creating a pressure no one in law enforcement could ignore. Solomon pulled out his phone and dialed a personal number he had saved from his days as a strategic security advisor. The call was answered after 3 rings. He offered no greeting, only spoke quickly and directly. "I need a hearing, no prior notice, as soon as possible. It must include a representative from the Civil Rights Commission, the Department of Justice, and a representative from the Department of Defense. If the media catches up first, the entire chain of control collapses." There was silence for 3 seconds on the other end, a pause from someone weighing friendship against the system, risk against duty. Then a deep voice replied, "You know that request will make a lot of people uneasy." Solomon's tone was firm. "That's exactly why I called you. This is no longer about a single city. This is a test of whether the law still means anything." 30 minutes later, a message was delivered to Solomon's encrypted device. The closed meeting was confirmed. Location, basement level 3, internal security hearing room at the Civil Rights Commission headquarters in Washington. Time, the following morning, 6:40. No media, no recording, no prior notice to any party in Southridge. At that same moment, in the office of a senior member of the Civil Rights Commission, the sound of a porcelain coffee cup struck hard against a wooden desk. An internal advisor reread the meeting memo, frowning. "This time, we can't put out the fire." The other person nodded slowly. "We don't need to put it out. We need to let it burn in the right direction." This was no longer an isolated complaint. It was time to confront a chain of behaviors that had gone unchecked for too long, concealed by administrative jargon, vague narratives, and carefully edited files. Solomon's demand for an unscheduled hearing with no notification to the accused meant he was calling for the dismantling of the traditional defense mechanism, where the wrongdoers were warned to prepare their defenses and plan their escape route. A young staffer entered, set a new file on the desk, and whispered, "This one was accused in 3 other states before coming to Southridge." The department head flipped through a few pages and tossed them onto a thick stack already prepared. His voice was low. "We thought he was just a local officer. Turns out the system kept him around much longer than we thought." Solomon stood in the wind, phone now off, eyes still set on the hospital. His father was still there, surrounded by cold machines, the steady beep of heart monitors counting out each waiting second. But on another level, a shockwave was coming, and this time he would not let anyone bury it beneath the stench of bureaucratic reports. The suspension order for Maddox was signed at 8 o'clock in the morning, effective for 48 hours, pending full clarification of circumstances. No summons followed, no charges were filed, and no news cameras were allowed inside. The update appeared as a brief notice on the Southridge Police Department's website, wedged between announcements for the summer festival and a traffic patrol campaign. Maddox remained free. He even sat in his usual cafe on Main Street, one hand scrolling his phone, the other draped over the chair, looking as relaxed as after any routine shift. On his personal social media account, he posted a selfie in front of a sign reading, "Justice Break, back soon." The caption, dripping with sarcasm, said, "Another case about to fade, this time with extra cameras. Nice." Hundreds of comments followed, half from old friends, former colleagues, or like-minded followers who left laughing emojis and mocking words. The rest were curses, condemnations, and a swelling wave of shares. Public anger did not subside as Maddox expected. His arrogance only fanned it wider, cutting deeper into wounds already raw in the community. In a dorm near the State University, Kamira Ellis, a second-year sociology student, sat before her laptop, eyes red. She had replayed the clip of Elijah Booker being assaulted for the 3rd time that afternoon. Beneath it lay fresh articles about an emergency hearing requested by a man named Solomon Booker, the victim's son. Camira needed no further reading to know who Elijah was. She opened her social media app and typed rapidly, "Mr. Elijah fixed my mother's car and mine for 4 years. He never took an extra cent, even drove us home when the engine died. He is real, he is good, not a suspicious subject as someone wants to claim. This will not be forgotten." She added the hashtag #JusticeForElijah and a photo of him smiling under a tree beside the small garage he rented near the fuel station. Within 1 hour, her post was shared more than 8,000 times. Each share carried a memory, someone whose pipes he fixed for free, an elderly neighbor he helped carry groceries in the rain. Elijah Booker emerged not as a blurry victim, but as a father, a neighbor, a decent citizen felled on a concrete sidewalk for having the wrong skin color in the eyes of power. Solomon read these lines on a screen in the hospital waiting room. He did not reply, did not comment, yet his gaze lingered on Camira's post. Something deeper than an investigation was taking shape, not in government offices but in communal memory, where people still held on to the image of a quiet, kind man who deserved protection from the very system that spilled his blood. Inside the ICU, silence was broken only by the steady beeps of monitors and the faint vibration of the ventilator beside the bed. Elijah Booker lay motionless, sun-weathered face seeming a decade older under harsh fluorescent light. Bruises had darkened, pooled blood beneath his left cheek remained, and his eyes had not opened once since admission. A team of doctors entered, led by the head of intensive care, holding a thick file of records. They didn't waste words. After 48 hours of observation, Mr. Elijah's condition showed no positive changes. All light reflex indicators remained low, and his neurological response levels were nearly at the bottom. The department head cleared his throat, then spoke to Solomon in a deep, cautious voice. "We need you to sign off on the next steps, in case the patient cannot breathe on his own after another 48 hours. According to protocol, this is when we assess whether to continue artificial support." Solomon was silent for several seconds, eyes locked on the frail body wrapped in a white blanket. He didn't need to ask for confirmation. He had managed hundreds of life or meth scenarios in his career, had worked with special tactics units where every decision was the line between living and dying. But this was not some distant battlefield. This was his father, the man who taught him to shave with a straight razor, who stood behind him every time he lost heart, who wrote letters by hand throughout his first 2 years at the military academy. Solomon drew a long breath, then placed his hand on the hospital bed rail. When he spoke, his voice did not shake, did not rise, but came out steady with cold resolve. "No, I will not sign any papers until he opens his eyes." The department head started to speak again, but Solomon didn't allow it. He continued, eyes fixed on his father. "He survived a war. He carried wounded men out of firefights with these very hands. Don't talk to me about percentages. This time we will fight for him." The doctors simply nodded and quietly withdrew, leaving space for Solomon and the man lying motionless. He pulled up a chair to the bedside, opened his phone, and scrolled through posts from the community. Every story, every photo of Elijah Booker when he was healthy, smiling beside his toolbox, or carrying baked goods to a neighbor, all these became substitute heartbeats for the one now kept going by machine. Solomon sent out a single message. No hashtag, no appeal to the media. It went to a small group of old friends who had once served with him, people who had survived counterterrorism campaigns abroad by his side. The message was just 10 words. "It's time to bring this story fully into the light." Outside the hospital, the sky turned cloudy. In the narrow corridor, the shadow of a nurse stood quietly by the ICU sign, fingers gently tracing the letters, "Elijah Booker, ICU 2B." The man in that room had once been the quiet anchor of a small community, now transformed into the marker of a system on the verge of unraveling. And from that cold hospital bed, A new battle was igniting, not with weapons, but with every story told, every drop of blood, every hand held tight and refusing to let go. Near midnight, a call came in, the ICU hallway light casting pale glare across Solomon Booker's face, deepening the circles under his eyes. He had not left the hospital for almost 2 days, still in a dark suit with the tie loosened, tablet in hand logging every slight change in Elijah's vitals. The screen showed an unfamiliar name and number, yet instinct made him answer at once. A gravelly, clipped voice spoke, the sound of someone long trained in tense rooms. "I used to be internal affairs at Southridge. I know you are digging into Maddox. If you truly want this exposed, you need to hear this." Solomon waited in silence. The caller lowered his tone to a near whisper. Carter Maddox was once the son-in-law of City Councilor Lawrence Finch. The link stayed quiet until they fell out, but Finch still holds sway. At least twice I watched internal complaints against Maddox get edited, stamped, resolved, with no real investigation. Solomon frowned, pieces sliding into place. He pulled up his team's secure archive. 2 strikingly similar incidents, one involving a disabled man accused of resisting arrest, another a Latino teenager who broke an arm after Maddox subdued the wrong suspect. Both files were marked internally resolved in under 3 days, with no evidence attached. The man went on, voice tinged with bitterness. I tried to speak. My file was reassigned. I left the force 6 months later for being out of step with department goals. They never said it, but I knew. One call from Finch and the entire inquiry system froze, like someone hit a breaker. Solomon nodded slowly, though the caller could not see. "I need every detail on those interventions, dates, times, and any copies you kept." A pause, then, "I will send them tonight. Be careful. When power is wrapped in reputation and intertwined favors, truth is the cheapest thing." The call ended, yet Solomon sat unmoving, eyes fixed on cascading data. The Maddox cinch tie was more than personal trivia. It was a crack running straight through the system, proof that authority had become a shield against justice. He opened a secure channel to his independent analysts, ordering a trace of all internal calls linked to Finch over the past 3 years and a sync of every prematurely closed case, isolating those with racial violence markers. Now Solomon was no longer merely Elijah Booker's son. He was prying open a protection network built over the years, buried under administrative phrasing and brazen paperwork. For men like Maddox, the true danger was never a recorded video. It was a tracker who knew exactly where to dig and would not stop until the walls split wide. Solomon Booker closed the tablet, his thumb tapping slowly on the stainless steel table in the waiting room next to the ICU. He didn't text, didn't call anyone else. He simply sat still, as if every detail in his mind was being reorganized in cold, decisive order. From the shadowy relationship between Maddox and Lawrence Finch, to the concealed files, to the internal resolution system that had quietly buried a string of abuses. Each gray patch was taking shape, a web wrapped in legal language, powered by privilege, and dodging accountability through orchestrated silence. Solomon stood up, stepped out of the ICU wing, and pulled out his encrypted phone. He opened his official communication channel, the account reserved for national-level cases, with access to federal systems and full authority to send emergency requests to key agencies. He had once used this account to block a biological threat in New York. This time, he used it to sever the shield keeping Maddox out of prosecution. Only one sentence was written. No embellishments, no need for lengthy explanations. Understood, I will cut that line using my official account. He hit send, eyes fixed on the confirmation. Forwarded successfully, priority extremely urgent. In less than 20 minutes, a top-secret draft was formatted, tagged with an internal code, and sent to the Justice Department's server. The subject line needed no metaphor. Obstruction of civil oversight, evidence attached. Encrypted attachments included an audio recording of a call from a former internal affairs investigator, illegally altered files tied to Maddox, a detailed list of complaints suppressed within 3 days, and, notably, 2 internal reports that once recommended Maddox's badge be revoked, both canceled by a single phone call. In the letter, Solomon stated 3 points clearly. First, there was evidence of administrative interference to cover up systemic civil rights violations. Second, there was collusion between a law enforcement officer and an influential political figure to dismantle oversight procedures. And finally, the direct consequence was that an elderly citizen with a military background was lying unconscious with a brain injury while the perpetrator continued to boast online. The letter did not request a meeting or ask for explanations. It was a formal declaration of war, not with weapons, but with facts, with authority, and with the position Solomon had held for nearly 2 decades in national security operations. The only difference this time, his target was not a foreign extremist, but a system rotting from within. After sending, Solomon returned to the hospital room. He stood beside Elijah Booker's bed, looking at his father lying motionless, then leaned close to whisper the only thing he needed to hear. "They will not touch another innocent person as long as I am here." The monitor kept its steady beep, but to Solomon, that sound was now more than a heartbeat. It was an alarm, ringing out to places that had always believed themselves above the law. Maddox sat in the makeshift studio of a far-right podcast, a smeared yellow light casting pride across his face. He wore a white shirt with sleeves rolled, as if giving a serious policy interview, not excusing violence against an unconscious elder. A large microphone stood before him, 2 cameras framed him from the side, and to his right lounged the host, a former soldier discharged for racial misconduct, who now specialized in fighting the progressive wave. Leaning back, Maddox spoke in a steady, confident tone. "I broke no law. I am a trained officer, empowered to act when I sense a threat. The progressives always turn any race incident into a witch hunt." Applause and scattered laughter drifted from the control booth. The host nodded. "We need more officers like you." Steady under media pressure, Maddox continued. "I fouled the law. He refused ID, would not cooperate. Tell me why an old black man wanders an industrial zone at 6 in the morning. Strange, right? And remember, no valid ID, no relatives." The host burst out laughing. Yet some kid online calls him a silent hero. Feels like a movie. While Maddox tried to rewrite the narrative, an audio file spread at alarming speed across social media. Leaked from a private chat of retired officers, his voice was unmistakable. Each word spit out. "I knew that old guy was a vet. We checked already. But he was mercenary trash. A poor soldier, nothing to respect." A scoff answered, "Yeah, I do not salute some washed-up metal bragger with no status." The first user who shared the clip added no hashtag, only "Listen, this is the truth behind his mask." The community needed no further prompt. Within 6 hours, the recording appeared on every platform, and previously silent people spoke up with statements, data, and lists of hidden abuses. A retired professor sent an open letter to authorities demanding that Maddox be charged for systematic bias in duty. A volunteer lawyer group began assembling a separate civil brief, citing testimony from more than 3 suppressed cases during Maddox's Southridge tenure. The leaked audio was their central exhibit, time-stamped and matched against department data, arguing that he violated professional ethics and displayed organized discrimination, warranting civil and criminal review. Amid the uproar, the podcast became a focal target. Sponsors threatened withdrawal, and networks that had posted flattering edits of Maddox yanked the videos, replacing them with disclaimers that content accuracy was under review. More importantly, the name Elijah Booker no longer sat boxed as unidentified victim in old headlines. It now stood as a symbol of silence, broken by hard facts. Solomon watched everything from the temporary hospital office. He did not state on the audio, offered no comment on the podcast, yet felt a knot inside him loosen. When truth rings in the perpetrator's voice, no shouting is needed. Justice needs only time and someone willing to keep the fire lit until the very last moment. On the national news channel that afternoon, the screen was split in 2. On one side, a still video of Elijah Booker lying unconscious in the ICU. On the other, an older man with silver hair and a posture as straight as in his days in uniform. His name appeared in a small caption below, James R. Holloway, Marine Corps veteran, served in the Pacific Theater. The host asked just one question, softly. What do you know about Elijah Booker? James paused for a few seconds, as if something was caught in his throat. Then he raised his head, eyes red from sleeplessness, and rasped, I am alive, today, because of him. In front of the rolling cameras, James's hand trembled as he removed his veteran cap and set it on the table, then continued. That year, at the Hailstone Battle, the ammo dump was hit by enemy fire. We thought no one would survive, but Elijah, just a private then, ignored the retreat order, went back through the fire to pull me and 2 others out. They called him the Silent One because Elijah never talked about it. He never accepted any medal. He always said, I just did what needed to be done. And now, that man has been beaten down in the street by someone with a police badge. The broadcast switched to short community videos, spreading with the Justice for Elijah hashtag, now joined by the caption, Hailstone Hero. Those who fought beside him began posting photos, stories, and old records that had once been ignored. A blurry photograph dated 1944 showed 3 wounded soldiers being dragged from a shell-pounded field, with a small black man in the center straining to pull the rope through the muddy ground, now confirmed to be Elijah Booker. The Federal Veterans Association's homepage released an official statement. Elijah Booker is not an unidentified victim, as the police file once stated. He is the man who defended the truck ammo depot, who saved his comrades' lives, and who stands as a living testament to courage and resilience. We are not silent, and we will not let anyone walk away from the crime committed against him. That statement was not just empty words. In only 24 hours, more than 5,000 signatures from state-level veterans groups flooded the Justice Department, demanding that Maddox be criminally investigated for systemic abuse of power. Interviews with Elijah's old comrades were scheduled for television. Vigils began to spring up everywhere, not for someone deceased, but for a man in a coma wearing not medals but wounds delivered by someone paid to protect him. At the hospital, as Solomon played a eulogy from the Southridge Vigil, the light from the screen fell across Elijah's face, still motionless, but now something new filled the air. No longer the dark solitude of the early days. Now every story, every witness, every survivor, every tear of the old men in front of the cameras was forming an invisible shield around the hospital bed, and that was something no punch, no kick, no cover-up could ever break through. A special hearing room, buried deep inside a federal building in Eastbridge, held more than 300 seats. No television cameras were allowed, only a few selected reporters and the keen, seasoned eyes of Congressional Civil Rights Committee members. Stacks of classified files lay on the table, alongside hospital photos, internal complaint extracts, and the recent podcast video of Maddox. Solomon Booker sat at the center, dark shirt buttoned to the collar, the overhead light spilling across the open dossier before him. A committee official rose and stated, "We have convened this emergency hearing regarding the Southridge incident involving Officer Carter Maddox. Mr. Solomon Booker, you are here as witness and next of kin to Elijah Booker." Solomon nodded once. "I am ready." He had brought no lawyer, no speech. "I am not here for apology or sympathy," he began, voice steady. "Someone lies in an ICU bed with blood pooling in his brain after being punched in the street. A man who served this country, who once saved comrades under fire, is now called a leech because of his skin." A committee member signaled him to continue. Flipping a page, Solomon pointed to Maddox's photo. "This man has been accused 7 times, 3 involving direct violence against defenseless citizens. The system had chances to remove him, but did not. Why? Because he was once the son-in-law of a city councilor." Keys clicked as clerks recorded every word. Solomon's tone sharpened. "This is not my family's tragedy alone. It is the system's final test. After all that has been revealed, if no one is held accountable, why should the public trust any oversight body?" The delegate laced fingers and leaned forward. "You allege judicial complicity?" Solomon did not blink. "I quote an officer from his podcast. We act within the law. If the law permits knocking an elderly veteran unconscious and calling it legal, the fault is not the man who strikes. It is the code itself. We are here either to repair it or admit we are part of it. He set the file down, eyes fixed on the guardians of justice. I do not ask for fairness. I demand it, for my father and for the hundreds who never stood here to speak. The hearing atmosphere shifted from tense to a strange hush when Maddox was summoned. Note-takers stopped typing. Committee gazes converged on a familiar figure in a rumpled gray suit, face pale beneath the ceiling lights. The smirk from his podcast days was gone, arrogance drained. His hand shook as it touched the desk, and when sworn in, his rasped voice betrayed a truth he had not yet digested from the public's response. Maddox began, then stammered, gripping his fingers together as if to steady himself. I just followed procedure. That man, he refused to cooperate. I thought he was being threatening. I didn't think. He stopped, biting his lip, eyes flicking to the files on the table where images of Solomon's father lay motionless with IV lines on both sides of his neck. A committee member, a man with graying hair, silver-rimmed glasses, a deep voice that never needed to be raised, spoke suddenly, setting the file down, looking directly at Maddox. Do you know the man you assaulted once served in logistics on the Pacific Front? Before Maddox could answer, the man continued, his tone flat as if reciting from memory. In 1944, on Truck Island, Elijah Booker went back into an exploding ammo dump to save 6 people, 3 of them badly wounded. They survived because of him. Maddox swallowed hard, his face paled, his excuses catching in his throat. A female senator tapped her pen on the edge of the table, her gaze cutting through the uniform Maddox tried to wear as protection. And you, while just following procedure, called him a freeloading veteran. Is that correct? Maddox turned away, avoiding her eyes. It was a small gesture, but to everyone in the room, it was as good as an admission. No one raised their voice. There was no heated cross-examination like in televised trials, only a series of direct, concise questions from people who understood the law better than Maddox ever had. Here there was no need to coerce. They only needed him to reveal the contradictions already cracking open beneath his fear. Solomon sat at the end of the row, eyes fixed on Maddox. He showed no reaction, no emotion. For him, the point was not to prove the rage of a son, but to let the irrefutable truth stand before the entire system. Elijah Booker, the old soldier once dismissed as just another wandering homeless man, was now forcing an entire system to look at itself. And the man who thought he could erase that identity with a punch, for the first time could not find a single word to defend himself against what he had done. As Maddox stepped from the hearing room, the door had not yet shut when 2 federal agents approached, one holding an arrest warrant stamped in red, the other placing a hand on his shoulder. Maddox froze, half turning to protest, but the agent's unwavering stare cut him short. Carter Maddox, you are under arrest for intentionally causing severe bodily harm to a minority over 65 years of age, the agent announced, an offense categorized as race-based under the Civil Rights Expansion Act of 2019. The brief charge pierced the armor Maddox had worn for years in uniform. Camera shutters rattled like hail as he was led from the building, wrists cuffed. Headlines erupted. Officer Maddox arrested for assault on black veteran. First race-specific charge against police in a decade. Hashtag Justice for Elijah becomes legal action. On CNN, the evening news gathered constitutional experts. Attorney Natasha Harlan stated plainly, "This is not a mere shock to law enforcement. It is a judicial turning point. For the first time in 10 years, an officer faces a precise charge for harming an elderly black veteran. This sets a precedent." MSNBC replayed the hearing beneath a banner reading, "From unknown veteran to national symbol." Discussion turned to why it took nearly 80 years after Elijah Booker's wartime heroics for recognition and why a coma-inducing punch was needed to stir justice. Online, the hashtag #BookerJustice surged nationwide, sparking tens of thousands of posts from people who had met Elijah, heard his war stories, or had their cars fixed by him without charge. Solomon Booker remained at the hospital. He issued no statements, posted nothing, and declined interviews. Everything he needed to say had been said in testimony, and the legal packets he dispatched to 5 agencies were already analyzed, verified, and backed up. For him, The arrest marked only the first milestone in a chain of accountability that must reach the deepest roots. Inside the ICU, Elijah still lay motionless, yet monitors showed a slight improvement in heart rhythm. Nurse Clara checked the readings, exhaled softly, then whispered, "The whole country is watching you, Mr. Elijah. To us, you have never been invisible." Outside, amid the roar of public discourse, something fundamental shifted, not merely because of an arrest, but because a man who believed power was permanent had learned its limits. Set by an old man with silver hair and an indelible past. The light in the ICU remained gentle, just enough to reveal faces, yet spare, weary eyes. Solomon stayed by the bed, back curved, right hand resting on his father's chest. 18 days had passed since Elijah was admitted, no dramatic change. Deep coma, faint reflexes, yet doctors urged hope. Solomon needed no reassurance. He knew life sometimes lies beyond metrics, in sheer persistence, and Elijah Booker was no stranger to survival, whether against war, poverty, or a punch from a uniformed fist. He said nothing. Every day, he sat beside his father, holding the same posture as if the palm of his hand was the thread keeping him tethered to life. This morning, when Nurse Clara passed by, she left a small parcel tucked in a thin envelope. From the public mailbox. No specific recipient, but your name is written on the back. Solomon nodded, accepted it, and set it on the table without opening it right away. Nearly an hour later, he opened the envelope. Inside was only a yellow sheet of paper, handwritten in a slanted script with no clear signature, but every word was bold, the handwriting of someone not skilled at writing, but certain of what needed to be said. "I was beaten by Maddox in a parking lot 5 years ago," the letter read. "I was on the phone getting into my car. He thought I was trying to steal it. I explained, but he still pulled me out, slammed my head on the hood until my forehead split. I filed a report, made a complaint, but a few weeks later I was called into the local office and told, there's not enough evidence to open an investigation. I stayed silent because at the time I was about to lose my job and my child had just started school. But when I saw your father in the news, when I saw you in front of the committee, I understood one thing. I should not have stayed silent back then. Thank you for not being like me. Thank you for standing up." Solomon read the letter to the end, then folded it and put it back in the envelope. He did not need to know who the sender was. In truth, there was more than one person like that. Every hidden story, every case erased from the system, was a shadow between the lines of data he had sifted through these past 3 weeks. Each case was a fragment, and now the whole picture was coming into view. A system born not to protect the vulnerable, but to keep them silent. By the hospital bed, the monitor kept its steady rhythm, like the breath of someone diving deep underwater, not yet surfacing, but still holding on. Solomon looked up at his father, then quietly squeezed his hand. "There will be more people like you, Dad," he whispered, "but this time they won't be alone." He did not cry because anger had long since replaced every fragile feeling, and in that moment something was clearer than any legal verdict, that no matter how this story ended, it had already drawn a line that people like Maddox would never cross again. Morning rain traced thin lines down the clouded ICU window, while Elijah Booker woke to the steady beep of a blood pressure monitor. The first face he saw was Solomon, still in a wrinkled shirt after days inside the hospital. Elijah's gaze drifted to the ceiling, his lips moved, and the first words he spoke were not thanks or questions about events, but a rasping, familiar rhythm. "Are we back at the old base?" Solomon paused, smiled gently, and answered, "No, Father. This is Southridge Hospital. You are safe." Solomon tried to remain composed, yet his eyes brimmed, his throat tightened, weeks of resolve shattering in a breath. He leaned close, meeting the newly opened eyes of a man returning from nearly 3 weeks of coma. Elijah blinked, as if storing that sentence deep among overlapping memories, war, long silence, and this tender, aching truth. He slowly turned toward the misted pane, rain still falling. Outside waited no honor guard, no flowers, no flags greeting a soldier back from his quietest battle, and Elijah felt no surprise. He had never needed such things. News cycles had already shifted to fresh scandals, Elijah's name sliding from headlines. Yet for Solomon and those who had written letters, sent messages, or endured similar wounds, Elijah remained a conduit between a silent generation and one demanding recognition. A few hours later, Solomon left the room so his father could rest. The ward bustled as if no seismic case had shaken the city, as if that elderly man were simply another patient recovering. It did not discourage him. Investigations pressed on, new witnesses surfaced, and crucially, the system could no longer hide everything as before. Elijah had awakened to live on, and for Solomon, that was enough. A 74-year-old soldier opened his eyes, asked about an old base where he once survived shell fire, and realized he had returned from another war, this time on home soil. Equally harsh, yet he was not fighting alone. Outside the room, Solomon's phone vibrated non-stop. He ignored calls but read a message from his legal aide. The complaint has been filed, listing everyone who buried or delayed grievances against Officer Maddox. The document targeted more than Maddox, naming those who signed false reports, shelved evidence, or blurred the truth, all cross-checked by time-stamped files, internal network logs, and witness statements gathered across 3 states. Before evening, more than a dozen authenticated copies reached independent oversight bodies: the Federal Civil Rights Commission, the Office of the Inspector General, the Justice Department's Special Security Bureau, and 3 national investigative outlets. Each packet bore Solomon Booker's signature as citizen, witness, and next of kin. He chose no quiet negotiation. He exposed everything, start to finish, because a truth kept behind a door holds too little weight. The news agencies acted immediately. Names that had avoided the spotlight for nearly a decade were one by one called out. Some refused to comment, some hired lawyers, some deleted their social media accounts and turned off their phones. But the wave was rising, and this time there was no drain large enough to let the flood out. Public scrutiny did not stop at Maddox. It began to ask deeper questions. Who created the gap that let him exist? The question was not aimed at any one person, but cut straight into the structure of the city's entire police force, a place where the oath of honor was often used as a smokescreen for negligence, where complaint files disappeared as quickly as ink erased in water. At the hospital, Elijah remained weak but began to show clearer responses to light and sound. The doctors were cautious but optimistic. Solomon no longer stayed at the hospital all day. He moved between meetings, interviews, and a new assistant, but every night he still returned, sitting by his father's bedside. "Don't worry, Dad," he said once while changing an IV bag. "I am no warrior, but this time I have a whole army of law behind me, and everyone knows why." Elijah nodded, his gaze melting into the soft yellow light of late evening. The story was still not over, and perhaps it would never end neatly. But one thing had changed forever. An old soldier who was punched in the face for the color of his skin was no longer an anonymous victim. He had become a mirror, reflecting everything the system once tried to blur, and his son, with a quiet promise at the hospital bed, had made the entire system listen, if only for the first time. Within 3 days of Solomon's formal complaint, a quiet earthquake shook the city police department. Units that believed the storm had passed discovered no refuge this time. Officers were recalled for new interviews, not only Maddox but others, once thought untouchable. Internal affairs staff who had approved conflicting reports and trimmed original statements now faced irrefutable evidence. Recordings from the morning Elijah was assaulted were replayed. One voice said, "Old black guy sitting at the stop, handle him fast." The voice print was traced to 3 officers on that shift. When the chief was asked about the legality of that order, he muttered about overlapping procedures, a reply federal monitors rejected. Newspapers shifted focus from Maddox alone to systemic rot. The main headline read, "Not one punch, a network of clasped hands," and the local daily, once mild, published a full power map showing overlaps between police brass and city council seats. naming everyone who shredded complaints or killed inquiries, all cross-checked with data. Legal corridors reopened, files thought buried. A 6-year-old case of a man whose collarbone snapped under Maddox's knee is now linked directly to Elijah. The similarity was not the setting, but the attitude, the force, and the cleanup script. Those files, assembled like puzzle pieces, unveiled a cover that had lasted nearly a decade. Solomon stayed off camera, letting attorneys coordinate while he remained beside his father. Elijah, still unable to walk, spoke with nurses and doctors, piecing details like a veteran planning counter-strategy. They used a whole system to shield one punch. He chuckled. Now we use a system to flip them. Investigative reporters sifted data from 2017 to 2023, finding every signature and timestamp to prove Elijah's point. Truth, once assembled by justice, needs no slogan or march. It stands in numbers, dates, and dried blood on concrete. The story entered a new chapter. No longer victim versus assailant, but a community demanding change from signatories of deceit. Responsibility ceased to be a slogan and became action, all triggered by a punch, once expected to sink beneath old tides. That morning, the plaza before City Hall was oddly quiet. No loudspeakers, no chants, no drums. About 200 gray-hailed men and women stood in rows beneath a cool autumn sky, each wearing a gray tee bearing Elijah Booker's silent portrait. No words, only that face, stark and louder than any banner. Veterans arrived by overnight bus, on crutches, in family cars. Some who had served with Elijah in the 70s, others who knew him only through a grainy clip or an anonymous message. "We stand, we do not shout," one retiree told a reporter. "It is how we endured. No display, just no retreat." Images of the silent formation spread quickly, their stillness forcing viewers to look twice. Inside a 2-hour internal meeting, the final decision landed. Carter Maddox was stripped of his badge, for life, barred from any law enforcement post nationwide. The order was signed and released publicly. No secrecy, no delay. A federal indictment followed, aggravated assault with enhancements for the victim's age and race, carrying a proposed sentence of 12 to 20 years. At the precinct, his locker was sealed, nameplate removed, and system access cut. There was no farewell, no shoulder-slap photos. Colleagues who once laughed at his tales of schooling old black men now lowered their eyes and passed by. The downfall came not from a violent showdown or a cinematic chase, but from the very procedure he thought would shield him. When the preliminary charges aired on television, Solomon stood outside the state capitol meeting with volunteer lawyers. He glanced at his phone, nodded once, and said nothing. Elijah struggled through rehabilitation, steps still wobbly, right hand slow to respond, yet he knew he was not abandoned. For the first time in years, that city no longer turned away when an old soldier fell. In a 7th-floor meeting room at police headquarters, fluorescent lights shone down on a long row of silent, dark-suited figures. On the projection screen, the first slide showed a brief memo. "We have let one incident destroy 18 years of credibility." The workshop was led by the Director of Internal Communications, a middle-aged man with a close-cropped haircut, holding a remote but not pressing the button. No one spoke. No pens scratched, no pages turned, just a tension strung as tight as a live wire, waiting for a final spark. There was no press at this meeting and no internal newsletter was sent out. It was held quietly at the request of a group of senior officers after the department came under full federal oversight. Officially, it was called a Crisis Communication and Community Trust Assessment, but everyone knew it was a session of self-examination where every link in the chain was dissected. Someone raised a hand, slowly asking, "So, next time, what do we do differently?" The question fell into cold emptiness, then silence. No one answered. No one dared to. For the first time in years, silence was no longer a sign of power, but of impotence. A newly appointed young officer on the advisory board leaned forward as if to speak, then sat back again. He had witnessed many meetings with a similar air, but this time there were no lines like "manage the media" or "cool public outrage." The name Elijah Booker had escaped the reach of any defensive strategy. It was no longer just a name, but the contact point between fear and responsibility. Outside the meeting, in a white-lit hallway, a few admin staff passed by, glancing at the frosted glass door with a mix of curiosity and attachment. They too were tired of the cycle of scandal, investigation, and burying the outcome. But this time, it felt different. What was being touched was not just a single rogue officer, but the very foundation of power that once allowed every mistake to be justified by a stamp and a signature. An older man near the end of the table, voice low but firm, said quietly, "If we still need to ask what do we do next instead of what should we have done right, there is no good next time." No one objected. That line remained in the internal record, unedited. It did not create an action plan, but left an uneasy tension for those who once thought power could obscure truth. The session ended earlier than expected. As people filed out, their eyes stayed on the floor, no one looking back at the first slide. The phrase 18 years was still there, but now it was just a relic, no longer carrying pride. Only the echo remained, reminding them that this collapse did not come from outside, but from every ignored word, every overlooked decision, every punch that was deemed lawful, until no one could bear to look away. In the main lecture hall of the State Police Academy, hundreds of new cadets sat straight in crisp uniforms, eyes fixed on the podium. Young faces, most still wearing the curiosity and hope of first entering the profession, awaited one person, a guest speaker for the seminar, Police and Community, Breaking the Bias in Law Enforcement. The name on the board was Solomon Booker, Deputy Director of Strategic Security, now leading a wave of civilian oversight reforms after a case that shook the nation. When the black car stopped outside the campus, senior faculty stepped out to greet him, their faces serious and anxious. They knew his reputation did not come from theory or reports, but from an event no one in the field could erase: the punch to Elijah Booker and the counterattack from his son. Solomon entered the main hall, still in his usual black suit, his gaze steady and cold. He passed the staff desk where many senior officers waited, then paused without stepping up to the podium. The microphone was ready, the spotlight set, and everyone waited silently for him to begin. But Solomon did not pick up the microphone. He looked straight at the front row, where the first-year cadets sat tense, then spoke in a voice that carried, "I was invited here to talk about implicit bias and systemic violence, but I will not do that." The whole hall froze. A few looked at each other. Some flipped through notes and worried glances at the faculty. A professor stood up. "We hope you'll share your real-world experience, especially about reform." Solomon did not look away from the front row. "I do not need to teach you ethics, because I do not believe ethics comes from a lecture. You already have my father as an example." A ripple of unease spread. He walked slowly to the edge of the platform, set down a photograph. Elijah Booker in old uniform, arm around a wounded comrade in the trench. No one spoke. Solomon turned back and continued. He did not know he would be beaten down at a bus stop past 70 by a man once taught that a badge meant the power to punish, not responsibility. He paused, pulled a trifolded note from his pocket. "This is the internal report on Carter Maddox. Complaints were once ignored. Cases handled in-house that should have been criminal charges. You should read it, but not for an exam. Read it to remember that every time the system shields a wrongdoer, it pushes a good person toward the fate my father endured." A young cadet in the back raised a trembling hand. "Sir, then where should we begin?" Solomon nodded slightly, looked away from the paper, and replied, "By understanding that every decision you make from now on will not just affect a workday, but could become the beginning of a national apology." He left the hall to a long silence, leaving behind a lecture that never began but ended with a message no one could ignore. The lesson was not on the screen, not in the curriculum, but in the presence of the man who had walked through tragedy with a silence that cut straight through the cracking shell of the profession's ethics. Elijah sat on the old wooden chair at the rehab house porch. afternoon sun stretching across patchy grass flecked with wild reed dust. His hand trembled around a chipped white teacup, steam still curling from the liquid. Scars, old and new, roughened his dusk-drecked face, yet his eyes held the same quiet depth that even war never dimmed. Before him lay a small field where barley had just been cut, leaving pale, broken stubble, a scent of damp earth replacing the gunpowder he once knew. A mild breeze lifted dry leaves that drifted onto the step beside his worn canvas shoes. From the dirt road, wheels crackled, and a black boy of about 13 in a gray t-shirt and mud-specked shorts stopped at the gate. He propped his bicycle, clutching a plastic-sheathed photograph, and approached with shy resolve. Elijah lifted his gaze, offered a slow nod. "Were you a soldier?" the boy asked, voice low yet clear over the wind. Elijah rested the cup on his knee, waiting. The boy held out the picture. Elijah, in youth, helmeted, chest caked with mud, hauling a wounded comrade. "They say you were beaten into a coma. I wanted to know if you truly served." Elijah studied his face from 3 decades past, the dried blood on the rescuer's brow vivid in memory. He nodded. "Yes, back then we had no fancy armor, only each other to survive." The boy absorbed the words, then said, "Thank you." Elijah leaned back, wind at his neck, sunlight along his ear, and replied, "No thanks needed. Just choose the right people to trust when you can." The boy slipped the photo into his pocket, pedaled away, the wheels murmuring into the distance. Elijah closed his eyes, drew in the wild grass air, and exhaled softly. His left arm still quivered, yet he no longer raised it to shield his face. This battle used no rifles, but he knew survivors must speak, so the forgetful lose every excuse to repeat harm. Inside the back room, Solomon sat at a desk, an old leather notebook open. Among hundreds of notes, one page was ruled off in red, bearing a single sentence. "I do this not so Father is remembered, but so he never forgets." The handwriting was slanted firmly. Solomon had written it the first night after the attack, while Elijah lay unresponsive. Not anger, but clear resolve drove him. He needed no statue, no heroic headlines. Elijah had never called himself a hero. He was a worker, a father who endured fears modern America claimed it had buried. Solomon shut the notebook and slid it away. He would not repeat Maddox's name, nor prove anything further. The evidence was filed, the shield wall cracking. His task now was to keep the story true, to be sure the next generation knew someone was felled for his skin color, and someone else rose not for revenge, but to end the cycle. Outside, Elijah rose, gripping the wooden rail, stepping inside with the slow rhythm of long seasons. The door closed behind him, leaving the porch in late-day hush, where a cooled cup, a warmed memory, and a future newly drafted awaited the coming dusk. That story was never adapted. No director called to buy the rights. There were no props, no reconstructed bus stop, no lighting cast across the face of an old man beaten into a coma, no major media outlet scheduled to shoot, no Netflix, no Prime, and no award ceremony reserved for those who survived battles with real blood, not screenplays. The story quietly closed in the low space between 2 breaking news flashes, swept away in the whirlpool of a busy, crowded, forgetful world. Elijah did not become a symbol, had no Wikipedia page telling his life story. He did not appear in any civic ethics textbook, nor was any law named for him. But somewhere else, amid millions of comments on an international forum, one anonymous account left a simple line: "I do not know who he is, but I will teach my children not to stay silent." That line was not the most liked, was not pinned, and had no moving soundtrack, but it was there, clear enough for anyone reading to pause, then share it on. In an age where truth is so easily edited, the act of teaching your child from a little-known story is already a quiet but most effective form of resistance. Solomon saw that line late at night, when everyone else had gone to bed, the screen glowing before him. He did not reply, did not send thanks. He just stared for a long time, as if something in those words was growing, outlasting anger, outlasting the need for quick justice. It was a vision of a next generation that would not just learn how to survive, but how to live right. Elijah never saw that comment. He did not care about viral terminology or community campaigns. He simply sat each morning, running his fingers over scabbed scars, breathing deeper week by week. Sometimes he forgot the day, forgot the doctor's name, but he never forgot the kick to his old cloth bag or the sound of his flesh hitting concrete. The story did not need to stand out to matter. Not every story needs an audience. Some truths exist to remind quietly that among the hundreds of lives made invisible each day, there are still those who stand up and quietly draw the final line that the harmful can no longer cross without consequence. And that is enough. A final, simple hashtag lingers in the sea of drifting content on social media. He did not deserve that. No interpretation needed, no label attached. Those words contain everything that happened, from the quiet bus stop at dawn to the tense public hearing. His name is not in big headlines, but the truth remains. Elijah Booker, a nameless soldier who survived the brutal years of war overseas, had to fight one more time, this time with no trench, no uniform, no right to self-defense in the very country he once gave his youth to defend. The story is not about a punch, nor is it just about a single cop. What happened to Elijah was the result of a long chain of hidden violence, where power is given to those who see abuse as their right, and where skin color is still the default excuse for suspicion. Carter Maddox was not an anomaly, but the product of a system built to protect itself, to excuse itself, until silence became the real achievement. It was that silence that almost killed Elijah, that almost killed a generation's faith that they had a fair place in this society. Solomon Booker did not come to rescue anyone. He did not arrive as a hero. He came as a son, someone who understood that silence in the face of injustice does not make you neutral, it makes you complicit. Everything he did, from accessing systems, finding evidence, sending urgent letters, bringing the story to the press, to his words at the hearing, came from one place. His father deserved to live with dignity, and if the system once denied that, he would force it to face the truth. The important thing is not that Maddox was arrested. What matters more is that people finally had to ask, who kept him there for so many years? The old complaints, the deleted cameras, the people once beaten into silence, they were no longer scattered fragments. They became a mirror pointed at the heart of the system, forcing everyone to look and respond. And for the first time in years, an officer was prosecuted for racially motivated violence, not because the media demanded it, but because no one could deny it anymore. But the biggest lesson did not come from the meeting room or the police station. It came from the smallest responses, the comments from people who never met Elijah but saw their father, their grandfather, or themselves in him. A boy biked over just to say thank you. A stranger sent a letter about another assault. A mother decided to teach her child about courage through a man never mentioned in textbook. These moments were never televised, but they are seeds. And like every real seed, they need time, need earth to cling to, need will to grow into action. Elijah Booker survived not with a loud victory, but with the quiet endurance of a man who once believed that human worth needs no sermon, just respect. He no longer goes to war, carries a weapon, but his very existence, however fragile, became the loudest protest. He did not ask for a monument, he did not need an audience, but he left a reminder that cannot be ignored. Justice does not come from greater force, but from relentless resolve in the face of wrong. And that is enough for this story to be told again, line by line, glance by glance, silent nod by silent nod, just as truth always finds its way through every layer and stays. Thank you for staying with us through the end of this story. It is more than a narrative. It is a fierce slice of reality, where a father once thought forgotten becomes the spark of awakening, where silence is no longer an option, and where justice, though slow, can still be reclaimed through intellect, resolve, and unwavering love. If this story made you pause, reflect, or rethink the society around you, then it has fulfilled its purpose. Share it. Tell someone. Remind them that somewhere in America, an elderly man named Elijah Booker survived 2 wars, and it is up to us to decide how many more such wars will follow. Do not let this fade like just another online post. Let it be the thing that keeps us from turning away. And if you ever ask yourself, what can I do? Begin by refusing to stay silent.